A big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. If you need a website or a domain, go to squarespace.com/James for 10% off your first purchase. Morning everybody, and I apologise for the deja vu some of you might be feeling. I was here filming a video just a few weeks ago doing some scouting of that barn, cottage, farmhouse. I don't know what we're going to call it. Anyway, that turned out to be pretty unnecessary really, because I decided that the best shot, one of the best shots, was a 50mm profile shot just straight in front of it. Really didn't need much of a scout, incredibly simple. Also, I don't know what the deal is with those cones, youths probably. Anyway, scout in the bag. I've been waiting for amazing winter conditions, snow, ice on all of this, but it's not come. And I'm going away next week, so by the time I get back, the chance of winter conditions will have diminished greatly. So this morning what I thought I'd do is come out in moody conditions instead and just get one in the bag this winter. And if I have to wait for future winters for this shot, the shot that I have in my head, then so be it. But I'll come and get something in the bag. Now, as I said, when I came, I decided that it was going to be a 50mm shot, but actually what I've decided since then is that I want to use an 85mm and shoot this as a panorama. Now, I posted a photo a number of weeks ago now on my Instagram from Iceland, which was a panorama, about a 25-shot pano, I think, handheld, and I've since had lots of questions about it. So I thought I'd go through the process of showing you how I capture a handheld panorama today in the hope that it's helpful in some way. Right. Now, in many cases, I think people get their knickers in a twist about shooting panoramas, whether they're on a tripod or they're handheld, because they worry about whether it's going to stitch okay. But in truth, in the past sort of 10 years or so, software has improved incredibly. And so long as you do lots of the right things in the field, you shouldn't really have any problems anymore. It's quite a bold thing to say, as I'm about to show you a panorama that may not work, but it should, in theory, so long as you follow these steps. Yeah, just get this bag out of the way. Right, first things first, we need to shoot pretty much entirely everything manually when we're shooting panoramas, because we can't have the camera making any of the decisions, because those decisions the camera's making might change between each of the shots that we're trying to get to bring the panorama together. And it's one thing trying to adjust the white balance for each of those shots after the fact in post, but it's another thing entirely trying to adjust the focus of each of the shots individually after you've taken them, which actually you can't really do. So you need to make sure that all of the shots are exactly the same in terms of exposure, in terms of focus, and ideally in terms of white balance, which shouldn't be difficult. You just set the white balance to something other than auto white balance, but everything has to be manual. Right, now for white balance, I'm going to select daylight, I think. I mean, I could use cloudy as well, but to be honest, I can change it in post. That's not too much of a problem. What would be a problem is if the individual images have different white balances, because, well, that'd be a faff to make them all equal before I stitch the panorama together. What else? Focus. So yeah, with focus, you can do it one of two ways. You can either just focus manually from the off, just point your camera at the subject and focus manually on that subject, or you can do what I do, which is autofocus on the subject, and then as soon as I've focused, I flick the switch on the lens in this case to manual focus. And that just means that the camera shouldn't keep autofocusing from that point. Now, exposure, that is what can catch some people out when you're shooting panoramas, because typically the whole point of what you're doing is to shoot a scene that's wider than what you can see on your lens, and therefore trying to work out what your exposure should be when it's made up of things that aren't included in your current shot, that gets a bit tricky. All I can say is that if you're shooting like a horizon, for example, then pointing at the horizon or somewhere in the middle of the frame that's got a reasonably large amount of contrast, I think that is the way to go. Here, there isn't much contrast, it's a very flat scene, and therefore I'm just going to point the camera straight at the barn and work out my exposure from there. And then everything else around the scene should be fine, because even at 85mm, I do have some sky and I do have some foreground in this scene. So working out what the exposure should be should mean that that's fine for everything else too. So this is what you see at 85mm, albeit on a 16:9 crop. So as you can see, you can see some sky and some foreground. Right, so for exposure, I've selected manual mode, and the whole point of me getting this scene with an 85mm lens is that I can shoot at f1.4. So I start with the aperture of f1.4 and then I can work out what I want my shutter speed to be, which I think at 85mm I want to be probably no slower than 320th of a second. Now bear in mind, if you're making this panorama out of, I don't know, 10 shots, you need every single one of them to be pin sharp. And if one of them isn't, the whole panorama's ruined. And that ultimately means that you should probably use a faster shutter speed than you otherwise might consider at this focal length normally. So 85mm, I'd always typically shoot at least 80th of a second, 100th of a second, something along those lines. But because it's absolutely critical that 10 times in a row, or however many shots it's going to take to make this panorama, every single one of them needs to be sharp. So I don't want to take any chances, and therefore I'm going to shoot at 320th of a second. And then the only thing left from there to do is to select an ISO, which I suspect, I don't know, ISO 250 from here. That's not too bad. Now I mentioned shooting at f1.4 for this scene, but I don't think I've really explained yet why I've chosen to shoot it as a panorama at 85mm as opposed to 50. There are a number of reasons that you might want to shoot a panorama. The main one is that you might want to capture a scene that's wider than your widest lens. You might also want to shoot a panorama to capture a mega file with huge resolution. For me, what I want to do is capture a scene that's got a shallower depth of field than what is achievable at 50mm. And this is a technique that lots of wedding photographers use, for example, when they're shooting a couple in what they want to be quite a wide scene, but they also want a razor thin depth of field that you can't achieve with a wide lens, and therefore you have to shoot with a long lens, capture it as a panorama, and then it looks like a wide shot, but it's got the depth of field of a much longer portrait lens. So yes, that's what I'm doing today. Now, lots of people worry with panoramas about something they've heard of called parallax error, which is essentially an issue of perspective. So if you stick your finger in front of your face and you look at it with one eye and then the other eye, you will see a different perspective. And much the same can happen when you're shooting panoramas and moving the camera. Now, to tell you the truth, it's hardly ever an issue unless you've got things that are very close to your camera in the scene. You know, if you're shooting like a grand vista and the closest thing to your camera is a few hundred feet away, then moving your camera from here to here is not going to make a difference. However, if you're shooting something like down here and you move your camera from here to here, that might make a difference and it might make the stitch less than ideal. Now, lots of people spend lots of money on clever little machines that keep your camera in exactly the same place, or the nodal point of the camera in exactly the same place. To me, I think that's a bit unnecessary and can be sorted out with a bit of decent technique. Now, lots of people like to move a camera around their body when they're shooting panoramas. You'll see people shoot like this, and better technique would dictate that you try and keep the camera in exactly the same place, and you just move the camera around the front element of your lens as opposed to moving the camera around your body. And that should reduce the chance of parallax error. As I say, it's hardly ever a problem for the kinds of things that you shoot panoramas for, but it's good technique anyway. Right, should we try and get this shot? Right, before we get cracking, a couple of other bits of housekeeping. I am going to take a shot before I start the panorama sequence, and all I'm going to do in manual focus mode is just put my hand over the lens, take a shot, and that will mark the start of the sequence. I'll also do that at the end of the sequence so that I've got two blank bookmarking shots that enable me to know where the sequence starts and ends. And that just helps if you take, I don't know, 6 different sequences and then you get home and go, no, is that one where it starts? Is that where it ends? And it may well be obvious depending on the scene and how you've shot it, but better safe than sorry. I just like to bookmark the scene with 2 blank shots. Also, I've got the grid on my camera. I don't know if you can see that, the rule of thirds grid, and I'm going to make sure that as I'm shooting this scene, I leave at least one of those grids overlapping from the previous shot. Basically, you want to overlap by at least 30% to make sure that there's enough information for the software to stitch it correctly. I'll go into the stitching afterwards. I use Lightroom, but pretty much every software that I know of works best if you leave at least 30% overlap from the last shot. Bookmark shot and begin. Bookmark shot. And just like that, we're back. The magic of video, isn't it? Anyway, here's a sequence, and as you can see, it starts
with a black frame, because that's what I did. I took a black frame. And then we've got all these images which are included in the panorama. And then the end of the sequence is another blank frame. So all up, there are 29 images in this panorama, and I'm just going to grab the first one, obviously not including the blank frame, and then the last one, and I do that by pressing Shift and then clicking, and then I'll go to Photo, Photo Merge, Panorama, and then we just wait patiently while it pulls up the preview. What are you having for dinner tonight? What else can we talk about? Right, here we are several moons later, although to be fair, these are all 61 megapixel files, so it sort of makes sense that it takes a while. And now we can select our projection methods, and there's really no right or wrong to this. It's all about, well, personal preference really. That's why the preview exists. Typically, I find that I end up going with cylindrical or spherical, but it will depend entirely upon the scene that you've photographed really, so don't read anything into that. Anyway, select a projection method, hit merge, do the cropping necessary, and do the editing necessary, and what you end up with is a finished panorama. Now, as I mentioned, these are not the conditions I was aiming for, and therefore this is not the end result that I was aiming for, but I don't suppose you really care about that on the basis that this is just an instructional video on how to shoot panoramas rather than look at my photo, which isn't what I wanted it to be. And I'm sure I'll make a third video at some point, but for now, here is the final image, the 85mm 29 shot panorama, and here is a 50mm shot where I've used an aperture of f2.8. So it's by no stretch a fair comparison this really, but look at the depth of field differences in the foreground. And I think in different conditions, this could really play out quite nicely. And this, in this case, is why I wanted to use longer focal lengths across multiple photos in the form of a panorama. And as I mentioned before, that's just one reason you might want to shoot a panorama. The others are you might want a massive file, or you might want to capture a scene that's wider than your widest lens. The point is, this is a good way to do it, I think. And the things that you've really got to be careful of are getting enough overlap on your images, particularly if you've used longer focal lengths, because minute changes in the camera's direction using longer focal lengths can really have an impact on what's been captured by the lens, so you need to be really careful of that. And also, as I mentioned, if you're photographing stuff that's quite close to the camera, you need to be really careful to keep the nodal point, or as near as makes no difference, the front element of your lens in roughly the same place. I say as near as makes no difference, that will make lots of purists angry, but practically speaking, if you keep the front element of your lens roughly in the same place, you shouldn't have too many problems unless you've got something right next to your camera that is included in your scene. And in short, or as short as I could possibly make this video, that's how I shoot handheld panoramas. A big thank you for watching, and also a huge thank you to this week's video sponsor, Squarespace. Now, as I've said many times, I've used Squarespace for years. I absolutely love it as a place to showcase my work online. Also, as I mentioned recently, I've just kicked off my monthly newsletter. I did the last one last week, and thank you to everyone who signed up for that. And one of my favorite things about the Squarespace service is the analytics that you're provided. Now, that runs across things like email. I can see, for example, how many people have opened the email, but it also runs through website analytics. So I can see what content people are looking at, where people are dropping off the website, where people appear to be most engaged. And therefore I can make decisions on what I might want to include on the website in future, what I might want to drop. And if you've got an online business, or as I say, if you just want to showcase your work online, those tools are fairly invaluable and super simple to use on Squarespace. So if you're looking for a place to host an online portfolio of your work, or perhaps you'd like an online store as a place to sell your work, then definitely check out Squarespace. And you can do so for free by going to squarespace.com. And after that, if you'd like to make a purchase, then go to squarespace.com/James and you'll get 10% off that first purchase. And a big thank you to Squarespace for their continued support of this channel. Right, I'll see you next week, which might be the first of the Antarctica videos if all has gone to plan with Antarctica and me getting there. We'll see. I'll see you then.